Hey everybody, welcome to the Restoration and Conservation in Horticulture session. Hope everyone had a good lunch, everyone's having a good day, everyone's feeling good. Welcome. We'll get started so we can stay on time, make sure there's time for questions if there's any questions. So this session we're going to examine horticulture as a part of long-term conservation and for restoration. The sessions will discuss managing the recovery of a damaged or destroyed ecosystem that has been degraded and damaged or destroyed through traditional ecological knowledge and scientific understanding, and how horticulture can support these activities. So let me introduce our first speaker, Renee P. Murphy. Renee Murphy is an environmental scientist for Intrinsyx Environmental. Renee has a master's in plant science, agriculture from Cal Poly Pomona. As a native plant educator, she shares her passion for native plant restoration through lectures and workshops in the community. Formerly the sales director of a native plant nursery, Renee is currently an environmental scientist with Intrinsyx Environmental in the Bay Area, and Renee incorporates her native plant knowledge and agronomic background working to restore degraded and contaminated sites using phytotechnology. As a speaker, Renee has presented to Sustainable Silicon Valley and was a panelist speaker for International Water Holdings Corporation conferences across the Southwest. Next month, Renee will be presenting to the NASA sustainability team at NASA Ames and internationally in Cape Town, South Africa, at Nicolas Annual Conference for Resiliency, Nature, and Climate Solutions, striving for sustainable land management. So let me introduce Renee, also the co-chair of this session. Thanks, Renee.
Thank you, Chris. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So hi, I'm Renee Murphy, and today I'm going to talk to you about microbial endophytes and salt conditioning treatments on native tree establishment in the challenging ecosystem of the Salton Sea. How many of you have been to the Salton Sea? Raise your hand. How many of you know about what's going on over there in the Salton Sea? Awesome, good company. So I'm going to take a different spin on this research project. Over the last few days, you may have heard many successful stories of restoration. That's not my story today. I'm going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, or as we say in the science world, lessons learned. The Salton Sea was created by accident in 1905 when water from the Colorado River spilled out of a poorly constructed irrigation system. The lake grew over the next 2 years until workers were able to staunch the massive flow. By that time, a 400 square mile body of water had formed in the Salton Sea basin in Southern California. They called it the Salton Sea. The Salton Sea was once a popular Southern California tourist attraction, but over the years, the lake has been abandoned, and the waters grow increasingly toxic. There we go. So the issues with the Salton Sea, the water actually never discharges to the ocean. They either seep into the ground or it evaporates. And this condition has resulted with water with a extremely high salinity level, more than the Pacific Ocean, and it continues to rise with time. By the 1970s, rising salinity, shoreline flooding, and fertilizer runoff from nearby farmers created unsafe algal blooms, which give rise to elevated bacteria levels. The chemical shift in the water caused a number of environmental problems, including the startling die-off of fish and bird populations. How many of you have been to the shoreline and stepped on all those fish bones? Yeah, so have I. Once the fish began dying, the birds followed suit. In one day, a reported 640 birds were found dead. The cause was avian botulism, a disease that had been passed to them by the infected dying fish. So this drought continues to cause the sea to recede, exposing miles and miles of playa every year. And this exposed playa, a lack of vegetation, creates an environmental toxic dust, leading to an unhealthy air quality and other conditions in the area. In the 1990s, California state officials considered a plan to revitalize the area, but little has become of it. I graduated high school in 1991, and I'm almost 50 now, and I really can't think of any real advancement that has been made to restore the Salton Sea. So it's really a situation I hope at some point gets addressed. So let me tell you about the good about our project. I had the amazing opportunity to join this community restoration effort with the Torres Martinez Cahuilla tribe. They had the California Conservation Corps involved with them to help do all of the installation, and this was the largest restoration effort in the tribe's history. And what they were trying to do was take a huge swath of their land and plant native trees on that land, because their plan was, we can't get any government help, so we're going to try and take this piece of land into our own hands and start the restoration process. The funding came from several different conservation groups, and Intrinsyx Environmental donated the endophytes for the treatment, and the Land Life Company also donated the cocoons that you'll see in the research in the upcoming slides. Okay, so this project was aimed at finding a protocol of how best to proceed with future restoration efforts. Previously, the tribe had attempted to establish several different tree species, and they determined that there were two that were able to, there were two that had the best survival rate. And of all the trees that they planted, only 30% survived. The interesting thing is when I went out there and said, show me these trees that had survived, they were actually all dead. So they may have survived several years, but ultimately they had died as well. So these were the 4 treatments that we decided to do to a total of 1,782 native trees. We used only 2 species. We used honey mesquite and the Palos verde. And we decided that we were going to use endophytes, salinity, endophytes and salinity, and then a control group of which we used no treatment at all. So the reasoning behind the salinity treatment is we thought if we could treat the seedlings with salinity before they were planted, maybe they'd be a little more acclimated to the salty conditions. And then secondarily, we wanted to add microbial endophytes. And you may be asking, well, what is an endophyte? So endophytes are a naturally occurring microbe that has been isolated from drought-tolerant tree species that naturally thrive in a nutrient-limited area. So an example of this is in the rocky riparian zones, poplar seedlings establish on sites where few other plant species can grow. So these endophytes were actually isolated from those plants, and scientists have figured out that you can inoculate other grasses, trees, and plant species, and they would take on the characteristics of having less nitrogen requirements, less phosphorus requirements, and that ultimately it increased their drought and salt tolerances. So we thought we'll try these different treatments and see if it would help the trees survive in these conditions. So this was a 2-day planting day. This is the first day the entire community came out, and this is the California Conservation Corps, and we used these land life cocoons. And what it basically is a membrane sort of made out of cardboard, and it allows you to be able to plant the tree in the center, put water into the cocoon, put a lid on top, and then it holds the water in there, and the tree is able to, through a membrane, pull the water that it needs. Because there's no irrigation system, we had to fill the cocoons with water from a water truck. So these cocoons were very important in being able to maintain the water level for the trees for several months. So every month we went out there and collected the data. It took 2 people 5 hours and 5 miles of walking. Brutal heat, windy and cold, and you can see that's me on the very bottom slide there. There was actually a fire going on while I was collecting data one day. So it's pretty brutal out there on the trees. It's extremely dry, and the evapotranspiration rates on the trees is just, it's so high and very difficult for them to survive with that constant beating of the wind on them all the time. But that little cardboard white cylinder helps keep some of the wind off the trees. Okay, so this is 8 months, and wow, those trees look amazing, right? So I like to say that this is my Instagram image, but then there's a reality behind this. We had, at the 8-month mark, a 10% survival rate. Yikes. These happen to be 2 of the trees that were thriving. So it makes me happy to see those. But let's move on to the challenges that we had, or like I like to say, this is the bad. So our survival rate was 10%. Why I think this happened is I think there was, because the tribe wanted to remove all the tamarisk in the area and all the vegetation because it's invasive. I understand the point behind that, but I think ultimately we may have been better off had we left it there, because it would have provided some sort of wind protection and wind barrier to the trees. We could have always gone back and removed it later, but I think maybe that was a mistake. Secondary, the lack of water. So let me explain this a little better. The first day, the California Conservation Corps planted half the study, and then the second day they were supposed to plant the second set of trees, and they were called away to have to deal with a flood. And so we didn't have any manpower to plant the trees the second day, and they didn't actually get planted until 2 months later. And my understanding from the tribe is they never actually got water into the cocoons. So the entire second part of the project was basically scrapped. The trees had no water. The coyotes, my gosh, the coyotes probably took out 10% of the cocoons on their own. It turned out if the cocoons weren't covered in dirt and kind of hidden from the coyotes knew water was in there, and it would just rip the entire cocoon right out of the dirt. Another biggie, inconsistency in the planting. I noticed that the trees that were planted a little bit too high, I think got way too much wind damage, and the trees that were recessed a little bit were the ones that you saw that were successful. The trees were actually way too small too. They weren't grown big enough. They were only growing for about 4 months at the time that they were planted, and I think ideally they needed to be much older in order to make the cocoon work. And the last thing is I think the project was too ambitious. There wasn't enough manpower to really manage the project. So you can see here, this is the recessed part I was talking about, and there's a berm back there, and I think it protected the trees significantly if they were recessed that way. And within, some of the trees actually had a newly established plant community that started growing up and around the trees. And I think that this potentially could have been something that helped the trees as well. I'm gonna move a little quicker because my time's running out. So next steps. I would like to go back and try and do this again, and these are the things that I would change. I would make it a much smaller project, just 60 trees with 3 treatments. I would incorporate more community species because I think that they might help protect the trees. I would incorporate a windbreak or a berm. I would make all the trees very consistent in the planting, recessing them, and make sure they have adequate water. And I would use a much older tree, a full 1 year of growth. So I just want to tell you really quick, this is the ugly part about these types of projects. Projects are dependent on grants and funding of some sort, and sometimes the timelines can be really restrictive. This was a project that was taken over by a new employee, and he was basically like, Renee, we've got to get these in the ground by December. We don't have a choice. The money is done at that point. So basically, use it or lose it. So sometimes it's just not ideal. The trees aren't old enough. There could be something that we really don't think that it's going to be successful if we do it on that timeline. But sometimes the client just forces that, and that's unfortunate. At my job, sometimes we can't secure resources until permitting has been approved or a regulatory agency has given us a green light. And then that causes us to be at this race to meet unrealistic deadlines, and many times it's not ideal planting times. After installation, sometimes the monitoring and the maintenance isn't done correctly, and it may not be up to par, and that could result in your project not being successful. Any of these can derail a project or a research trial. For the many successful ventures that you've seen, remember there are so many projects that also fail. But you know what? Scientists fail every day. Failure is an essential part and an inescapable part of scientific research. Thank you. Here's my contact information if you have any questions. Yes?
When you say endophytes, what did you actually apply? Did you buy a commercial mix? And are you making the distinction between an endophyte and a mycorrhizal?
It's absolutely different. So it is a microbe that's naturally occurring within tree species that are already out there, but they've been removed from that tree species, and now they're in a lab, and they've been tested for these. When you inoculate them into other tree species, they take on the characteristics that we're looking for. For example, making them drought tolerant or tolerant to different contaminants, and they are able to utilize nutrients more efficiently, completely different from mycorrhizae. And the way that the trees are treated, it's actually treated with like a backpack sprayer or a root soak. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool science, yeah. But there's also endophytes that will treat specific contaminants like TCE or benzene or PCBs or TNT. I work for the company now, but at the time, I was just testing it as a scientist. Yeah.
I'm just interested in what your initial plan was for watering those spaces. For you to fill them.
So they were filled with water, and that would allow them to have enough water for 3-4 months. And again, they were going into winter time. So our thought was, this will get them to the winter time, and they should be okay. And then if the tribe could bring the water truck back out again, they might fill them back up again. But it's just not what happened.
No, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because you're thinking that it could sustain it that question.
Yeah, and honestly, when I would go out there and do when I would go out there and monitor them, I would pull them up, and they were still full of water. They were doing their job. It was actually a really cool product. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. The 10% survival rate, was that across all treatments in the study?
So here's another thing. The wind knocked off a lot of the tags, too. And here's the thing. At this point, the garbage is data, or the data is garbage.
Yeah, I was just curious, like, how the survival rate
At that point, I just threw the notebook into the air and said, well, you got to start over. But what we did learn is a better way to plant, different system. The holes are already there. So my thought is make a much smaller area. Just do 3 treatments. I'm not going to do it randomized. It was randomized. What a nightmare. Just do rows. It's okay. It's going to be okay. We'll do rows of treatments. Keep it really small and tight. And if we can get all of those to establish, then we've got something, right? We've got something.
And then were you thinking of digitizing, I guess, the experimental layout, so that way if the tags are blown away, you know, like, exactly what tree was under
Would have
which
been
treatment?
fantastic if I was only dealing with 120 trees.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would do a completely different system, but I learned a million ways not to do this one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are some of the native, like, herbaceous plants, like the Salicornia that you mentioned, that came up in some of, like, the surroundings of those plugs?
Yeah,
Are
they
coming up?
yeah, everywhere.
Ways?
Yeah, they didn't seem to have an issue, so why don't we just throw seed out and get those to establish and provide some protection to the trees, right? Yeah.
I was just curious if you also considered using a different treatment like rice hull ash or compost or something like that. Are you familiar with those?
I am, and that would step it up to a whole new level. The only issue is that the cocoon really does restrict because the 1 gallon's being dropped inside the cocoon, so there's not really an area for the different soil unless you were to put the tree straight into a hole and not deal with the water issue. But because we have no water, we couldn't really get creative with what we were putting in the soil. Because generally, my company, we would do that. We would do these different, biochars or special soils and compost to help make everything more healthy, but we're just very limited. It's like, do we want water or do we want, any amendments? Hi.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was so inspiring for
You're welcome.
bioremediation and restoration.
Inspiring for how not, I met someone in restoration and I was so sad and I told them what had happened. They're like, why are you so sad? This happens to everybody.
Yeah, there's
They're
so
like,
much to
man,
learn.
sometimes it takes 2-3 years before you got something.
And we have your lessons now too.
Yes, and now learn from me. Yeah, learn from me. And then there's things you couldn't control. I couldn't control the size. I couldn't control the labor. I couldn't control certain things. But the more you can get control of, I think, yourself. Yeah.
So I had one comment and one question.
Yeah.
The one comment was I was happy to hear about the Salicornia pacifica, the pickleweed.
Yeah.
I have a site around Richmond. It's very polluted, but we see the Salicornia coming up as well. And I remember hearing these stories about Native Americans plucking the fleshy pickle to sort of remove the salinity, and then they would burn it, and they call it glasswort. So I wonder if that's a mechanism for almost reducing the halophilic conditions.
We're using it in other areas in the Central Valley on ag land. Yes, absolutely. So you can actually eat it too. It's a gourmet. It's a gourmet thing that is kind of getting out there into the market. But if we could kind of get farmers to grow it and also get it to market where it's kind of in demand, it could potentially be a food source. Well, and having the honey mesquite trees out there would be a potential food source for flour, because the pods can be ground up into flour. So, if we could figure out multiple ways of doing this, look, it's also a potential food source, and
It's a good pitch.
Yeah.
And then the question I had was about the 2 tree species. Do you know what their genetic background was? Were they from the area or might have adaptations to hot, dry?
They actually were as close to the area as we could get them, and I only say this now because Deborah and I actually collected the seed ourselves from the desert area. Yeah. So it was, and again, the plan was if we could get them to grow, we would collect seeds from those trees from the area and continue to use these trees that have adapted.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Could you speak more to the salt treatment, and have you experienced that as being effective in more controlled environments?
So I had read in my nursery, and I just got the time up. What we did was just a little bit of salt and then increased it up to sea level we did 4 treatments by the time the trees went out. And the reason I had done it is because I had read that the nursery I worked for had done it in the past. So I thought, let's try it.
Does it work?
I don't know.
Work for them?
It worked for salt marsh plants that they did. I don't know if it improved the establishment, because you'd have to go back and measure that. And because my data ultimately didn't yield anything, I can't tell you if it worked. But I'll try again. Come back. Okay, so up next. Okay, so Ian Sexton is up next. Ian is a restoration ecologist with the California Institute of Environmental Studies. His role focuses on restoring native plant communities that support wildlife like nesting seabirds on the eastern Anacapa Island. With over a decade of restoration experience, his primary specialty has been controlling invasive species that threaten native communities. Welcome, Ian.
I hope my mustache is on straight. Sometimes the mask messes up the glue. So, again, I'm Ian Sexton, and I'm with the California Institute of Environmental Studies. We are a nonprofit that focuses on conservation of seabirds, and that might seem a little bit out of place, but I promise I'm going to talk about plants because I think plants are cool, and I don't really know much about birds. So, Anacapa Island is part of the Channel Islands archipelago off the coast of Southern California. It is just here east of Santa Cruz Island. We're south of Santa Barbara to the west of Ventura County. The island itself is made up of 3 individual islets, so you can't walk all the way across this island, even though it's only a little over a mile long, because it has these really steep cliffs that divide up the individual islets. So talking about East Anacapa, this was historically dominated by coastal sage scrub, and it's a relatively small area, only 106 acres. It's been really heavily invaded by introduced species, so we don't see as much of this coastal sage scrub anymore. It's also been important habitat for wildlife, such as an endemic deer mouse species, some script smearlets, and other seabirds nesting around the edges of the island. And then this year alone, one of my colleagues counted over 5,000 nests for western gulls. So that means that I can have up to 15,000 of my closest gull buddies following me around on any given day. They're a real treat when they swoop me and poop on me and get their little flapper feet on top of my head. Along with the wildlife, human activity has been active on the island for thousands of years. The Chumash have this as part of their ancestral homelands, and they have a strong oral history of how they came out to the islands on these tummels, these boats that they would build to cross the channel, and how they would land on Anacapa before dispersing onto the other islands. Then in the 19th century, Europeans introduced sheep to the island to use as ranching for wool, and you can imagine that that had really huge impacts on the ecosystems that were out there. That continues into the 20th century, and then in 1932, the Coast Guard built a permanent lighthouse structure on the island, and then a few years later built a foghorn that you can hear every 13 seconds if you come out to visit. Rain or sunshine, day or night, anytime, it's always there. Every 13 seconds, there's a foghorn. I don't hear it anymore. I trust me. It's really pretty pleasant. The gulls are way louder. And then they also installed some permanent structures so that they could house folks out there that were stationed on the island to upkeep the lighthouse. So we have to use that for housing now. So with this post-contact human activity, we have a number of introduced species on the island that had dramatic impacts. The mammals that were there, the sheep were introduced, and then also accidentally introduced an introduction of the black rat. These have been removed from the island now, so they're no longer having direct effects, but along with that, some tertiary effects with invasive plant species that remain on the island. We have a lot of non-native, we have a lot of introduced annual grasses, like you can see in the upper left-hand corner. I'm sure that's a major problem for a lot of folks across the state, as well as ice plants, like in the lower right-hand corner, we have crystalline ice plant and some introduced mallow species as well. Now this creates a major barrier for some more passive forms of restoration. We can't just simply go out and remove some invasive plants. We notice that if we remove things, we have secondary invasions and things like that that really limit the ability for that passive restoration to occur. And I think that there's really low recruitment because we have direct competition with introduced species, but we're also seeing areas with really low propagule availability. So areas that have been covered with invasive species for many, many years, we're not seeing regeneration from those sites, even if we remove those invasive plants, because that soil seed bank has been exhausted. Even though some of these species, they can live in the soil for many decades, we're just not seeing that natural recruitment. So we are going to do some active restoration. We're going to have some specific goals with that. We want to, again, reestablish coastal sage scrub communities and increase the cover and abundance of our native species while decreasing introduced species cover and increasing the native plant diversity. This is all to say that we're going to try and get some things going well for us so that we can have high quality habitat for wildlife. So we have resident land birds, such as an endemic song sparrow to the island. And there's migratory birds that we can see on our lower left-hand corner. We see migratory birds coming into our planted areas, and those planted areas are supporting large quantities of insects that the migratory birds can feed on and refuel as they continue their migration. And then also some of the seabirds like the Scripps miralit that nest around the island in sea caves. There's a concern there that with sea level rise, those sea caves become inundated and those are no longer available as nesting sites. So we want to establish quality habitat up on the top of the island that will act as refugia for those species. And so you can see in this picture we have an artificial nest box that's been installed in one of our restoration sites to hopefully create some opportunities to encourage them to come up to the top side. We haven't seen any, we haven't observed any nesting in those yet, but we'll continue monitoring that to see if we need to take any other actions to help entice them up onto the top. So here's this islet again. You can see towards the east on the right side of the map, we have some areas that my predecessors planted 2016 to 2021. And then you can see towards the middle of the islet some areas that we're going to be expanding into, some new restoration over the next few years to expand this out to another 10 acres. So in 2016, when this work started, we focused on this lighthouse slope. So behind the photographer to the left is where the lighthouse is. Looking downhill at this area, you can see a lot of bare soil. So there's a lot of concern about erosion and losing that topsoil that would support plant life. So we wanted to stabilize this site first. We got to use some great hands out there to help us out. We had school groups, we had other volunteer groups come out and join us. And we're using this as a reciprocal process. We don't want to just exploit the labor of people that are kind to us, but we want to be able to make this a good experience, create educational opportunities for people that come out to the islands, and then also focus on some groups that may not be well represented otherwise on the island. You can imagine that the ocean is a pretty large barrier for people to cross to be able to get access to this park, but this is their land. This is public land that is being held in trust by the national park. So we want to make sure that we are reaching out and finding access opportunities for people that are not currently able to access that. So we also seek out funds so that we can fund people's trip because they're coming over on boats. We don't expect them to swim 14 miles to get to us. We want to create those opportunities so we can fund boat rides for people to come out that wouldn't otherwise be able to do that. And you can see that I can't necessarily speak on everyone's experience and how successful their engagement with the environment has been, but I can say that we do see good results from our plants. We have a lot of great shrub cover. You can see in this photo from 2022 in the foreground, there's a mix of shrubs. It's hard to tell if maybe kind of in the middle of the photo before you get to those buildings, there's a denser stand of it. Kind of looks like one species, one color there. That's all Malva acergentiflora, the island tree mallow. It's an endemic species only found on Anacapa and San Miguel Islands. So it's a really cool species. I love it for a lot of reasons, one only of which is that it smells fantastic. Not the flowers, it's the plant itself. So you get the right breeze, it blows it in your face, and you're like, oh, wow, that smells so nice. I finally am not smelling just guano and rotting gull carcasses. It's an ever-present smell, but sometimes you can smell the malva, and it's wonderful. So building on that success that we had over the last several years, we wanted to move into another area closer to these structures. You can see that lighthouse in the background again. So in 1978, you have this photo where we still see remnant native plant populations doing well on the island. This is well after the sheep have been removed. So the black rats are still there, but even after the major grazer has been removed from the island, we have remnant populations. But in 2010, we're not seeing those as much anymore because we have this heavy invasive pressure from an introduced species. This is the red ice plant that you see in the 2010 photo. So there was a concerted effort to kind of get rid of that. So they went in and cleared a lot of that out, but there wasn't an ability to follow up from that and get planting into these areas that were cleared of the ice plant. And so we see a secondary invasion coming through of other invasive species, and we don't see that kind of autonomous recruitment. So we want to go into this area and build on our successes, lessons learned, and also maybe try out some new things. Because we do have this much heavier invasive pressure here, we're going to try out several different methods to restore this area. So you can see on the left of the screen, this pink kind of column. These are all areas where we're going to be trying to bulk up our seed. Again, we have relatively little abundance of native plants left, so we have seeds that have been collected from the island, so we're only using single island genetics out here. We're growing those on the island in a nursery that's purpose-built on East Anacapa, and then we're going to use those to plant out in the field and grow and try and bulk up our seed availability for us, focusing on workhorse species, really large shrubs that will be useful for stabilizing those sites so that we can have a good soil structure for nesting seabirds to be able to burrow into and stabilize that soil, not having their nests erode out from under them. Also creating lots of dense cover that will help shade out some of those introduced species. And then we have a myriad of treatments that we're going to try out in a randomized design. Just testing out, seeing if we can get seeding to work. That's been mixed, limited, maybe no success sometimes with seeding in the past. So we're trying out how we can get this tool to work for us rather than against us, trying out some different matting types, jute versus coir, trying out some overhead water supplementation to supplement the limited amount of rain that's coming on through drought seasons, and then also testing out a newer herbicide that'll be acting as a pre-emergent, so we can apply it to the ground that'll leave the plants that we have established out there in place, but it'll be really controlling things as they germinate, so it's really focusing in on those annual invasive species while leaving our perennial native plants in place. So I'm relatively new to CNPS, so please come up to me afterwards and introduce yourself, especially if you're from our local Channel Islands chapter. I'd love to hear people's good ideas that they have for this or any other additional questions, hear about your projects. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to the National Park Service and our partners there, as well as my colleagues at CIES. Cool, and I think we have just a few minutes for some questions. Anyone has any? Yes.
I'm curious, do you guys do any annual plant seedings out on Anacapa?
Yes, so with those seeding trials that we're going to be doing, we have a couple of annual species in the seed mix. The question was if we were seeding with any annual species. And so, yeah, I have some California goldfields and distant Phacelia or scorpion weed that we're going to be seeding out there. That's not something I've done previously, but we've always kind of talked about it. So I'm really curious to see how that's going to go about.
And then I was also curious, on top of that, the picture that you had from 1978, it was kind of hard to see what plants those were. Were those red maids?
I'm not entirely sure. That was a slide that I was borrowing from one of my colleagues at the Park Service.
Okay.
That I just kind of recently got. I can tell you that there's some giant coreopsis in there. That was the most obvious one to me.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes.
A lot of the islands are experiencing problems this year with pelicans, and are you dealing with those as an invasive species in terms of like crushing down large areas of vegetation?
So yeah, the question is if we're dealing with the problems with that the other islands might be experiencing with pelicans. This can be a little bit of a contentious issue, especially because I work for some folks that are really focused on birds. We do work with the pelicans. So the pelicans on Anacapa Island are primarily nesting on Middle and West Anacapa. West Anacapa is a little bit more intact, but those are areas because it's protected for the pelican specifically. We don't really have access to anyway, except for very short windows of time when they're not breeding, basically right now and about a month ago.
Well, that's for now, but next year, guess where they're going to be?
Yeah, so it's yet to be seen. I've been observing them in that original lighthouse slope restoration. And my guess is that different plant species, different shrubs are going to be more sensitive to pelican activity than others. I think that the island tree mallow, it puts up with a lot. You know, I saw it earlier this spring get hammered by insects, completely defoliated that entire stand, and then it just regrew leaves, and it's doing fantastic now. And I'm not seeing the same level of damage from the pelicans, which do happen to, right now, they've been roosting there overnight. But some of the things like Sueda taxifolia, a lot more damage. But, sorry, back here.
Unlike some of the other Channel Islands, obviously it's a much smaller piece of land. Santa Rosa and Santa Cruz kind of maintain a lot of their biodiversity. They have big protected canyons, Lobo Canyon. And going off the last talk as well, the wind exposure on those islands is absolutely insane. So when you're talking about that water retention with reduced rain, that something you're kind of really trying to heavily saturate at times, or are you trying to be a little bit more cognizant of watering?
Yeah, so watering is another contentious issue on Anacapa Island because we have no freshwater sources on the island. We have to bring them out about 12,000 gallons at a time on the landing craft. It's an old, military surplus vehicle. And we're putting it in these 100-year-old redwood tanks that leak like a sieve, which actually has been beneficial to us because we capture that and we pump it into some tanks that we get to use for our irrigation. What we've been doing previously has all been drip irrigation for our plantings. So we're trying to do deep waterings infrequently so that trying to drive those roots down into the soil profile to use some of those better reserves. And hoping that also the vegetation is going to help with that water retention in the soil. We might need to be a little bit more conscientious about how we do that in the future and think more critically to see, because it's yet to be seen how well we're storing water in the soil and whether or not we can create conditions for autonomous recruitment where we are not active agents in forcing things to recruit out there by planting them. The irrigation that we're going to first try out with our seeding areas to supplement rainfall is going to be overhead. That may be a huge folly. Obviously, probably people in this room know that that's not the most efficient way to water, so might need to be experimenting with some other ways of putting irrigation on the landscape that's not as pinpoint as a drip irrigation, but other systems that we can saturate the soil more broadly without wasting it with overhead irrigation. So yeah, there's a lot to work to be done there. Thank you for that question. Got one here.
Thank you. Just want to point out the red flowered plant was a South African ice plant called Mellifera crocea for that picture. I did my research out here.
So yeah, the invasive one, but
right.
But then the 1978 was a dip where they were different species.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I had two quick questions. One was, are you collecting seed on west and middle? And then second question, are you considering fog capture for water?
Yeah, so you're going to have a real treat coming up after myself. There's going to be probably some good talk about fog capture. This happened on Santa Rosa Island. I haven't personally toyed with fog capture on East Anacapa. I know that some other folks before me have. We can still sometimes see their fog capturing devices that have been blown across the island, and we're rediscovering them. Things get really well redistributed by that wind. But it's much lower in elevation, so there's less fog potential, is my belief right now. That doesn't mean that there's absolutely no potential for that to help supplement. So that could be looked into again in the future, but I need to read up more on what people's experiences were in the past. And I think that I forgot the first part of your question. Yeah, seed collection. Yeah. So there's a lot of seed collection on west because that does have much more topographical variation. We have those canyons that have protected some plants in there. So there's a lot more remnant plants on west. So that is a good seed source for Anacapa. Middle is, I saw that for the first time not that long ago, and it is devastated. It's really dominated by annual grasses and some Salsola. Salsola tragus is really heavy out there. And then ice plant on the steeper slopes. There's not much to collect on middle. But yeah, again, West Anacapa, we can only get out there for part of the year, which is unfortunate. So it limits what we can collect there. So I'm just getting as much as I can from east. How are we doing on time? 1 minute. Maybe one question?
Hi. I know y'all probably have PTSD from the sheep, but have you ever considered doing some small areas of grazing where the annual grasses are really bad, or are the endemic and rare species too much of a concern for you to think about that?
Yeah, I think that it would be a real tough sell if I were to even joke about it with the Park Service. Biosecurity is a huge problem out there. So even if they were open to the idea of a grazer there, I think just the biosecurity hazards of bringing an animal from the mainland and all the invasive species that they could introduce would be a huge problem. but that doesn't mean that it's not worth looking into potentially analogs to grazing. So some ways that we could mimic that could be interesting. Obviously, mowing and other things like that probably deserve an extra look.
Thanks.
And I think that that's all of my time. So thank you very much. Find me after this.
Thanks, Ian. Next up, we have Marisol Villarreal. Marisol grew up in San Francisco, which is a Costanoan Ohlone land. After receiving her teaching credentials, she spent an unforgettable 3 summers learning about restoration research on Santa Rosa Island, which is Chumash land. She currently lives in Davis, which is Patwin land. Marisol?
Thank you for the introduction. I am Marisol, and I'm currently a geography student at San Francisco State University. You can't see my slide. I'll be talking about Santa Rosa Island specifically, and this research is part of a greater effort known as the Cloud Forest Restoration Project, which is the brainchild of Dr. Catherine McEachern, who is actually here today. And I invite you after the session to go downstairs to the end of the hallway. Dr. Catherine McEachern has a poster with a QR code that takes you to the geonarrative story map that tells you more about that greater effort. So far, hundreds of people have been involved in the project. Most of them start off as students at California State University Channel Islands, or CSUCI, including Stephen Bednar, who currently works as a GIS technician for Tejon Ranch Conservancy. And today I'll be focusing a lot on background because I think that a lot of the research doesn't make that much sense without that context. Thankfully, Ian gave you some of that context already, so that'll go by a little bit faster. And I'll end with what the findings mean for future restoration. So if you ever find yourself on the island, you arrive at the pier and you get to a fork in the road, and the left one takes you to the campground. It's a mile walk, and there's no rolling equipment allowed, so be prepared. If you take the right fork, you're going to get to the CSUCI research station, and that's private, but across from it on the road, there's a schoolhouse, and it's a one-room schoolhouse. It's public, you can open the door, and there's photos along the walls that were curated by the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, and that's where I saw this photo. This photo shows vaqueros, or cowboys, herding cattle on the island, and I want you to picture this in your head when I give you more information about the overgrazing that happened. Gonna skip this one. That's where we are. So some of the history, the Paleo-Indians or Native American Chumash people have been there for thousands of years. Some records on some of the islands, 13,000, so a long time. And the Spanish colonizers not only removed the stewards, who, by the way, are still around. The blue jewelry I'm wearing today was made by Chumash artist David Paul Dominguez, so if you can't give land back, buy stuff. And all those animals, the cattle, the sheep, horses, and at some point, trophy elk, they were out there. A lot of these animals that were not naturally occurring really decimated the landscape. And when the above ground biomass is gone, sometimes the below ground biomass, that root web that holds the soil down, sometimes it goes away, and with it, the seed bank that would help regenerate the vegetation. Thankfully, all of those are gone. Yay! And some of the land still had that seed bank, and that part of the land is restoring itself because it now has the opportunity to grow. But some parts of the island, like that question earlier about erosion due to wind, that's still a real concern. And that's why I have this photo. I want you to take a look at the right side. You can see what looks like a cement bucket. There used to be a chain link fence here, and if you've never built a fence, you start by sticking a post in a cement bucket in the ground, and that's what's left. So that's some of the erosion that has already occurred. And this is taken on the lee side of Soledad Ridge Mountain. So that's the part that's sticking out, where the cloud forest was, where the trees could harvest the water of the clouds passing through the top of the island. In contrast, This is a valley in the island. You can see no exposed soil, lots of vegetation. All the brown is probably ripgut brome, not native, but there's a pretty healthy population of coyote brush, which is one of the 2 study plants that I was involved in measuring for this research. The goal of the research is to restore the cloud forest, but oaks take decades and centuries to become established. We have to start with the little guys. So that's the coyote brush, which is an evergreen perennial in the sunflower family. And also, we looked at a purple needlegrass, which is also perennial, but this one will go dormant in the summertime or in drought. And if conditions are favorable, they will set seeds and flowers, and they'll look a lot taller. So that'll be relevant later when I talk about height. This is the restoration site as seen several years ago. So the project initiated in 2016. 240 of each of those 2 species were planted out on this site, and I was not there for that planting. But in the 3 summers after that, I measured all 480 plants, or what was left of them, to see what happened. Here's a bird's eye view of the same site. You can see the red dot on the inset shows you where exactly Soledad Ridge is. And on screen, you can see green blobs. Those are the remaining oak trees of the cloud forest. This whole thing used to be covered in an oak forest, and this is what's left. And there's 12 rectangles on screen, and those were the experimental plots. There were 3 treatments and 4 different soil types. That's why we have 12 plots. And actually, I want to point out, the grove of trees on the lower right, there's a patch of, oh wait, I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. Okay, so these were the 4 soil types up on the ridge. The first site was actually pretty good soil, a couple feet deep. It was the most soil that was up there. The second site was literally bedrock, and for those of you light on geology, bedrock is the crust of the earth, so if you take a shovel and you dig down and you can't get any further, either you hit some hard pan or you hit bedrock. And the third site looks a little bit better, but it's still mostly bedrock. And the fourth site was also deep soil, but it has some construction debris. You can see there's a glass shard. So in World War II, this island was of interest to the U.S. government. They set up a naval base, and most of that has since been demolished, and there's little evidence here and there, a bunker on the south side, and a metal star where there used to be a flagpole. These were the 3 treatments. So in the first year, all 480 plants received supplemental irrigation, but for the control group, which is the blue one, that's the only help that they received. And I do see people taking photos. You should know this is online, so you can do photos, but don't worry about it. And then the second treatment, you'll see there's some snaking features on the landscape. Those are wattles. So the purpose of the wattles is like a low barrier to collect some soil as the wind is pushing soil away. And the third treatment was a combination, wattle and fog fence. The fog fences were 2 feet tall, made of wire mesh with a plastic shade cover, 40% cloth. And you can see it in action. It's an overcast day, but you can see the water on the bottom. That's just from natural passive fog collection. And in a healthy ecosystem, the trees would be doing this themselves. The trees that are there are still doing this, but in the places where they're absent, those bare areas don't have the benefit of that fog collection. And throughout this presentation, I have color and shape coded the 2 treatments. So orange square is the wattle, gray triangle is the fog fence. So later when I have graphs, I have it color coded to match. All right, quiz. All right. Okay, what's this? Yes, water. I hope you said water. And then what's the darker feature over there? Wattle. Okay, don't get confused. Water and wattle. And then what's absent? No fog fences. And then why is there a cement thing sticking out? What caused that? Yes, probably the military built the fence, and then later the wind erosion took it away. Great, we're all together, yay. Okay, so I've used a measuring tape. This is just a regular tailor's tape. I teach sewing. I made this skirt. I also used a caliper to measure some data. For the coyote bush, we measured 3 things. We measured the diameter of the stem at the base, which maybe tells you how much of a root mass is going downstairs. And then I used that tailored tape to measure the canopy area. We did length and perpendicular width. And then height. This was not a true height. It wasn't from the ground. It was snaking the measuring tape along the stem of the plant. And then for purple needlegrass, we did height and flowering presence or absence. I'm going to skip my methods because you can see it online later. So this is a graph showing you the average. This is the raw data. I'm going to save the statistics for the end. So I have the color-coded blue, wattle is a square, and then fog fence is the triangle gray up top. And so you can see with each additional year, all the plants were doing better, but with each additional treatment, they were doing even better than that. And I found something similar for the other parameters, although when we were looking at canopy, wattle, and fog fence actually flipped, but they're still really close to each other. And then for height, same thing. With each additional restoration treatment, the plants did better. Grass did something a little bit interesting. It takes a dip in 2018. And in dialogue with Dr. McEachern, we thought, well, maybe it's because 2018 was a drought year and the plants didn't really like it, so they didn't grow tall. And that is not just conjecture. That's supported by what was actually happening. So this is the same raw data, but by the numbers. And this is not percents. This is a number of plants. So each treatment had 80 plants, so there were 240 purple needlegrass. And when they were planted in 2016, obviously all of them were still there. But every following year, we lost some. But the ones that survived, some of them set seed. And you can see in 2017, that's like 3/4. A lot of them are really happy. They made a lot of seed. But in 2018, less than half. So if they're not making seed, they're not sending out that flower, they're not getting that tall. And in 2019, they recovered a little bit, more like a half. Now we're going to take a look at survival. Reminder, herbivores. That's what caused this. Okay, this is the survival by treatment for the coyote bush. And again, this is not a percent, this is by the numbers. So of the original 80 per treatment, there was some die-off every year, but the die-off was less with every additional restoration treatment that was added. And the same is true for grass. Although it's a little bit more similar across treatments. And there's something interesting, again, going on with 2018. It looks like, by the numbers, it looks like some plants died and then came back. They maybe decided to skip out on that harsh drought year. So they didn't break dormancy. Okay. All this data I collected and put in Microsoft Access, and when I tried to do the statistics on my own, which I thought I could because I taught AP biology for a while, I was upset because my confidence intervals were overlapping, but Dr. McEachern put me in communication with a statistics professor at Claremont College, and she asked me to reorganize my data so that I was looking at not by treatment, but by treatment and soil site, so that by aggregating everything, I was losing some of the details, the differences between soil site. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm showing you the same data, but rather than being the raw data, I am using ANOVA statistics to tell you whether or not it was significant, what the treatment did compared to the control. So you'll notice the next slides, they don't have the control because that's what we're comparing to. We have the wattles with the orange square and the fog fences with the gray triangle. And I don't expect you to remember any of these symbols. I have made it purposely redundant where every time we're looking at a table, these same symbols are included in the slide. But in general, a positive sign, good trend, we like it. No significance, treatment didn't really do anything. And then the more asterisks you see, the greater, better that data was. So for soil, for the soil at Site 1, which is that deep soil, it looks like the soil was already there, so the water didn't really do anything. But the fog vents really helped. That's good. Okay, and then when we look at Site 2, we get mixed results. This is the site that had bedrock. So the wattle, it only helped the grass, and the grass we saw earlier did pretty well across treatment anyway. But it had an effect for the height of the coyote bush, no effect for the canopy size or for the diameter of the stem. And when we look at Site 3, similar. Wattle wasn't super impressive. Again, this is a bedrock spot, but the fog fence helped. And when we look at Site 4, which is the one that had construction debris, this one, the wattle actually did help, which is a little bit interesting. And in conversation with Dr. McEachern, we thought, well, maybe it's because of the 12 restoration rectangles, this site, the 3 that were upslope, maybe they were experiencing more wind, and so the wattle was helping. And the fog fence helped as well. And then for height, this is just purple needlegrass. We saw the purple needlegrass data previously. I just wanted to aggregate it by site. So you can see that the fog fences helped in a couple of the instances. So the conclusion, the question, do wattles and fog fences matter? You have to remember that each of those had a different purpose. So the wattle was to stop erosion, and the fog fence was to harvest some water. So the conclusion is, overall, we want to say that yes, they benefit. We tested that through various parameters. Bedrock maybe wasn't very helpful. Maybe we shouldn't focus too much on that site specifically. And the only parameter that benefited from bedrock was increased height with the fog fence. So, but each treatment was helping a little bit. So it depends. So survival was even pretty much throughout the treatments, slightly better with the fog fences. And for the grass specifically, the flowering was affected. And so both species benefited, but differently depending on their life history, the site, et cetera. So I want to spend a moment to thank all the people that were involved in this research, specifically Professor Diane Thompson. This is where all the funding came from, and these are the logos of all those organizations. I have a few extra slides. This is me in 2019 removing some of the fog fences at Site 1. You can see the coyote bush is doing really well there, and that's Dr. McEachern's husband. He helps out a lot in his free time, and the coyote bush is doing well. This is a screenshot of the USGS story map, where I said later you can go downstairs and get the QR code. This is what it looks like. It takes, at least on my computer, it takes like 5 minutes to load. There's lots of information there, so give it some time and spend an hour. And then if you want to see these slides specifically, I have this presentation, some research posters, some videos, some lesson plans, etc. Like almost anything you want is up there. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
Yeah, hi. First of all, great job. This is very worthy and exciting and important work, especially given the circumstances on the islands in the history. My question was about some of the sites. You said one of your sites was just bedrock. That wasn't, I can assume, like a naturally exposed. It was because of the erosion and the ungulates and things like that, right?
Yeah, so it's a combination of the ungulates denuding the landscape by eating the plants themselves, and then being so high up on the island itself that it experiences that wind more than other parts of the island. So, combination, yeah.
And you actually attempted planting?
Well, I wasn't there for the planting, but Catherine was. Yeah, question? Yes?
Yes, I liked your presentation a lot. I love that fog fence idea. Question. Here's a
Yeah, that's a little better. So I love the fog fence idea, and I loved your presentation. One of the tricks, so I'm in the landscape construction, native landscape construction business, and one of the tricks that we used to do when we're trying to establish oak woodland is we would plant them in and amongst, or plant with it, companion plantings of Baccharis. And it would really jumpstart things, and you'd see a lot of really positive growth response in that. And I was curious, A, did that idea occur to you to start adding oak seedlings? And B, are you actually seeing some native recruitment of volunteers on there? And are those agrifolias or tomentellas up there?
Oh, these are the native island oak, Quercus tomentella, and there are definitely lots of other plantings going on. My research was specifically on these two, but there's bishop pine. There are oaks being planted from acorns. There's Calistesia, bindweed, the native one. All sorts, lupin, buckwheat. They're all up on the ridge. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Question?
So on the island, obviously, it's the only other spot you find Tory pines. And when you're on the island, they seem very distinctly separate from one another. And you're talking, like you were saying, those companion plants to allow them to help capture that moisture. Tories grow a little bit faster than oaks. I'm not sure if they just don't work as companion plants. The Tories seem to be more in that scrub oak.
Yeah, so you're right that there are multiple types of conifers. There's no Tory pines up on the ridge because that's not where they're naturally occurring. The bishop pine, though, is very fast. It can complete its lifespan in 20 years. So that is currently up on the ridge. They were planted 2018, 2019. They're already taller than I am. Yeah. Oh, time's up. Thank you.
Okay, next up we have two presenters, Jonathan Snapp-Cook. He is a Partners for Fish and Wildlife biologist with the U.S. and Wildlife Service in Carlsbad, California. Jonathan assists private landowners to restore ecosystems in Southern California. Jonathan studied geography at San Diego State University and botany and sustainable agriculture at the University of Santa Cruz. And joining Jonathan, we also have Sarah Mazanov. She's the executive director of Earth Discovery Institute, which provides educational programming to under-resourced communities and partners with land management agencies across San Diego County to restore native habitats. Sarah holds a BS in biology from the University of Colorado and is a PhD candidate in ecology at Colorado State University. Welcome.
Well, Sarah and I are happy to be here at this conference and happy to be in this section. Glad to be with other restorationists. Our project started out as kind of a backyard garden project and with our sights set on restoration. So what we set out to do is create a local seed source of native milkweeds collected from wild populations in San Diego County. Along with Sarah, other authors that helped us on this paper were Ann Baldridge and Cody Hale from the Greater San Diego Resource Conservation District, and Mary Duffy and Christina Beck from Earth Discovery Institute. This work is done under a partnership that we have in San Diego called the San Diego Pollinator Alliance. It's a collaboration that we formed in 2016 with public and nonprofit organizations. And we set out to network similar groups with similar goals in San Diego that wanted to work on pollinator conservation. For the first few years, mostly what we did was help organizations install small pollinator gardens. And this is a picture from the San Diego County Fair, where we had a lot of volunteers from the California Native Plant Society every summer. And we estimated about 70,000 people visited that garden. It was a perennial garden. and taught people how they could install pollinator habitats in their own areas. We also work on education, outreach, and habitat improvement. We now have a program called Pollinator Habitat on Working Lands, and our group is coordinated mainly through funding from Partners for Fish and Wildlife program, with the RCD doing the majority of the organizing work there. This slide shows all the logos of our partners that we currently have in the San Diego Pollinator Alliance, and it's important to this project because the main way that we worked on our pollinator habitat is through these partnerships, and so we wanted to leverage these partners in order to create this local seed source for milkweed. So I'm going to give kind of overview of the program, and then Sarah's going to talk specifically about one of our sites that we worked at and created a milkweed farm. As you've probably heard, the monarch butterfly is in decline, and it's kind of an all hands on deck project. So down in San Diego, we wanted to be involved with this, and we're part of the western, all of us here in California, part of the western population of monarch butterflies. So I just wanted to bridge this gap between monarch butterflies and native plants. The milkweeds in the genus Asclepias are important host plants for the monarch butterfly, meaning that the monarchs need milkweeds in order to lay their eggs, as that is the only food for caterpillars of the monarch butterfly. Our native milkweeds are important for the survival of the monarch because as they go dormant in fall and winter, this encourages the monarchs to move to their overwintering habitat. And also because the native milkweeds die back in the winter, it allows the plants to regenerate from new sprouts, which on the tropical milkweed, which is popular in gardens, these don't go dormant in the winter. So the spores from one of the main disease vectors that's, I wrote the scientific name of it up there, but everyone calls it OE. It builds up on the plant. So in the native plants, when they die back in the winter, that spore goes down to a smaller amount. So as we started thinking about planting the local milkweed, we started asking our nursery partners if they were growing any plants from local milkweeds, and we found that very few were. Also, when we planted the milkweeds that were available commercially in our gardens, they weren't doing very well. And so we did a common garden study with some locally collected milkweed and those that were available commercially. And we found that the local ones did better, potentially because of San Diego's unique climate and soils. So we called all the different nurseries that we could, and we didn't really find a good source commercially for the native milkweed. So we scratched our heads and thought, what should we do? And so we started working with a variety of partners, both land managers and plant growers, native plant nurseries, as well as native plant seed companies. And we developed a program with, instead of just funding one source, like doing a contract grow for native plants, we just asked different nurseries if they wanted to be involved with the partnership, offering them a small stipend for supplies, and then worked out a memorandum of understanding so that they would grow the seeds, and then they could keep half of what they created for their own purposes, and then they would kind of put half of what they grew back into the partnership. This booklet from Xerces, I recommend highly. It really helped us through this process from collecting seed through growing them. It's free online. And so what we're hoping to show through this presentation is just not that you would necessarily need to use our exact methods, but that in other places in California, you could probably set up a similar partnership. So our program had 3 parts. We collected the seeds from the wild, then we worked with our local nurseries to propagate the seeds, and then we worked again with local nurseries, but also doing public events to distribute the seeds out to the public. It was a 3-year project, and each of the years we kind of had a different set of steps. First, we were really heavy on collecting the seeds from the wild. Then the second year, we sort of increased our communication with our nursery partners so that we understood what they were growing or what they needed assistance on. And then the third year, which just the season that passed, we started to get seeds and plants that we were able to distribute to the public. And really what we're trying to do is not distribute plants that weren't from our local seed source. So this is a map of San Diego County. It shows the different locations. Most of our slides focus on the narrowleaf milkweed, but in years 2 and 3, we added the woolly pod milkweed and the California milkweed. I now have some slides just of the habitat where we found the native populations, and then some slides from our nursery partners. One surprising thing I found in the wild, a lot of the plants were growing in riparian areas, and in this location in Carlsbad, which is on CDFW land, the plants were up to like 6 feet high in the shade. Out in the wild populations, we did find evidence of monarchs flying around and also laying eggs. So this is a little monarch egg. This just kind of illustrates the process from bagging the seed pods to collecting them. Here we have some of our nursery partners. Butterfly Farms has a live flight house. They grow a lot of different species of native milkweed. Native West is one of our local nurseries for restoration. Moosa Creek grows a lot of plants both for restoration and for retail. Anderson Seed Company does some local production of native seeds. And then S&S was able to grow this whole quarter-acre field with the plants that they had, both some earlier collections from Camp Pendleton as well as some Camp Pendleton seed. That's a Marine Corps base that was part of the partnership. And then just to summarize, just so you know, milkweed has about 300 seeds per gram and 140,000 seeds per pound. So mostly what we were working with was just talking about how many seeds we had in grams, either how much we were collecting from the wild or how much we were able to produce. But then last year, S&S Seeds was able to produce 18 pounds of seed. And so that really skyrocketed our efforts. All of a sudden, we had enough seeds to package up, to give to the public, and to get out to other growing partners. And really what we're trying to do through this partnership is work on this, kind of provide a catalyst to the pipeline so that as nurseries were selling the plants, they were selling what was local to San Diego County. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah now, and she's going to talk about their experience on the Earth Discovery Institute.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Sarah Maisonneuve, I'm Executive Director of Earth Discovery Institute. The mission of our work is to inspire stewardship of San Diego's native biodiversity through environmental education and conservation. So we have two primary arms. One is this environmental education arm where we deliver environmental education primarily to under-resourced, underserved communities in Southeast San Diego County, primarily with students who wouldn't normally get out in nature at all. And the other arm is conservation, whereby we partner with land management agencies at the federal and state level, as well as with private land conservancies to support habitat restoration and biodiversity conservation. These two sets of programs are often integrated, whereby students will plant plants, native plants on conserved lands to support the land management plans. And for standalone restoration projects, we also try to incorporate community volunteer efforts and planting efforts. So why did EDI, as a small nonprofit with finite resources, want to get involved in this project? Monarch butterflies, as Jonathan alluded to, have recently been listed by the IUCN. He wanted me to mention, definitely not by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service yet, as endangered, but they're clearly an imperiled species. And they're also what we call a flagship species, so they're one that most of us recognize, a lot of people care a lot about. So this was a great opportunity for EDI to participate in a conservation project to support a clearly imperiled species and also engage and educate the public about the importance of conserving pollinator species generally. So we've got this problem. We're telling everyone to plant native milkweed, but there is no native milkweed, so we decided we're going to start this native milkweed farm. First thing we do is partner with Endangered Habitats Conservancy. This is a private conservancy with which we often partner to do habitat restoration. They kindly gave us a little parcel of land on a property called Lakeside Downs in South County where we could install this farm. First thing we did was install irrigation and a plan to install 3 rows like you see here every year over the next 3 years. And in our first year, we planted 200 stratified seeds and 200 non-stratified seeds. That was May of 2020. We found, and we didn't have the bandwidth to do a controlled study here, so we've got, this is anecdotally what I can share with you. The cold stratified seeds grew taller and more robust than the non-stratified. And in that first year, germination was so successful that we actually had to thin the seedlings, so you can see they're growing pretty thickly there. A few plants matured, flowered, and even produced that first year, so it was really pretty successful. In summary, over these 3 years, year 1, we planted the 3 years of fascicularis, the narrow-leaf milkweed. Year 2, we planted 2 more rows of the narrow-leaf and another row of Areocarpa. And we've done the same thing this year in 2022, 2 additional rows of fascicularis and Areocarpa, 1 row of Areocarpa. That second year, we were able to harvest 20 grams, so not as much as S&S seeds with their pounds, but you know, we're not a nursery. And year 3 we're harvesting right now, so maybe we'll be in the pounds. We'll tell you next week. We're starting the harvesting is happening at the moment. And these are our volunteers, by the way, out on the farm who make everything possible. In case you all want to do this at home, we do have some general tips for growing native milkweed. Locally sourced plants germinate quite easily. As Jonathan mentioned, the seeds that we collected from Northern California just didn't germinate very well in our system, and these locally sourced seeds really germinated quite easily. We collect them in these gauze gift bags, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner here, and those kind of wrap the follicle, so when they erupt, we're able to capture all those seeds. Again, the cold stratified seeds worked really well for us in a refrigerator at 40 degrees for 6 weeks up to 4 months. Once planted, you know, people kind of lose faith because they're not coming up, they're not coming up, they're not coming up. But once temperatures warm to 80 degrees, if you keep everything irrigated, they really will germinate. We found irrigation is definitely a must, as one of our staff biologists always says. These narrowleaf milkweed like wet feet and full sun, so that's definitely been important for us. Benefits to the milkweed farm for EDI. So is this worth it to EDI, given we're never going to be a nursery or produce seed at the level of a nursery? I would say certainly yes. One of the benefits has been transparency. So as a nursery, we don't have trade secrets we need to keep to ourselves in order to sort of stay in business. We can afford to be very transparent about our methods and share those with the public, with other growers, and so on. We're producing a local source of seed and plants, so we know where the seed's coming from, and we can give it to those local restoration projects. Monitoring wild populations, that's been useful for us and something I want to continue to fund into the future, detect interannual variability. Public engagement. As we know, conservation is largely about changing human behavior, and so public engagement is very important for us. We've gotten a couple, articles in the San Diego Tribune about our work and the importance of planting native. Community volunteers are integral to our work. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll rush through this, but outreach events, we're able to distribute, hundreds of packets of seeds every year, and again, through our plant sale as well. Lessons learned, again, EDI will never produce at the scale of a nursery, and that's okay. So again, if this is something you wanted to replicate, keep that in mind and think about what your goals might be and why you might do this. Again, transparency has been a key benefit to us. This is experimental in nature, so a lot of trial and error, see what works in your particular system with your particular native species and what does not. The outreach opportunities for us have been at least as important as the farm productivity itself. Again, educating the public is a big part of what we do. Volunteer labor force, essential. Just to manage the farm, install it, and so on. Partnerships make the world go round. Jonathan mentioned the myriad partnerships that have made this whole project possible. And of course, funding to cover staff time, project coordination, and so on. Want to thank all of our partners so much. Jonathan mentioned Ann Baldridge. In addition to the two of us, I would say Jonathan and Ann really coordinate the San Diego Pollinator Alliance. And we've got some additional authors, important donors, volunteers, and so on. Thank you all so much for your time. I don't know if we've got time for questions. Okay, yep.
Question, Jonathan. Nice to see you.
Hey, Greg.
Anyway, how close to the coast are you seeing narrowleaf? Because I know Xerxes gets a little, they don't want to screw up the flyway, I understand that. How close do you see it?
So I think with the monarch conservation, it being a national effort, there's always a little bit of gray area in the stepping down of things that work for the whole country, things that work for the whole state. And so in this case, we're getting a lot of state guidelines. Right now, what Xerxes would like people to think about when planting narrowleaf or other milkweed species near the coast is if those milkweed plants might impact a monarch's butterfly's ability to use overwintering sites. So the first guideline was kind of a statewide no milkweed within 5 miles of the coast, but we know in San Diego County there's very many populations that are naturally occurring that are close to the coast. Also, we have the benefit of being down in the far southwest corner, so we can just do what we want.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle Stevens. I'm an ethnobotanist, and something you'd really probably like to consider, especially for education, is that milkweed's a very important ethnobotanic plant. In my research for a fish net, it might be 60,000 stalks. I've been all through the Delta. There isn't the milkweed. I've helped make regalia. There isn't the milkweed. It dies down in the fall. That's when you make the fiber with it. So something about that spore may tie in also to how it was co-evolved and traditionally managed, cut off and harvested when the stems start to die back. And plus with kids, when I do some of my teaching, we teach them how to make fiber and things, and then they have a more intimate relationship themselves with the plant.
Oh, thank you for that comment. It would be interesting to talk to you a little bit more. Up front here.
Yeah, I realized that the growing situation was kind of more of a setup as like a farm, but wondering if you have any tips. Oh, thank you. I realized that the growing setup that you have is more in a farm style setting, but wondering if you have any tips for preparing for direct seed in restoration style, like any preparation you would do for the ground.
So we didn't amend the soil at all, and it's just bone dry out there, and I can't believe it grows at all. It's almost like sand. So I would say no. Just, plant it an inch or two in the ground, but again, full sun and wet. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't see weed, so is that like a...
Oh, yeah. Well, we definitely weed. We do a lot of weeding. Yeah, that's important, of course, yeah.
Question about the thinning. Why did you decide to thin the seedlings? And the reason I ask that is because in the wild, when you see seedlings occasionally, or even mature plants, are often very dense. So I just wondered who told you to seed them, to weed them or thin them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is sort of at the beginning of my tenure. So I just sort of went along with what our biologist was sort of guiding us to do at that time. But I'd say that we're now in our third year of that little patch, and it's very successful. So it's sort of going like gangbusters. But of course, in a natural system, it's going to take care of itself. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks, everyone. And you're certainly welcome to contact us if you'd like more info.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, finally, we have our last speaker and also our co-chair, Cris Sarabia. I think I was. One more time. Sarabia. I like that. Cris Sarabia is the Conservation Director for the Palos Verdes Peninsula Land Conservancy and will be presenting about Seed LA, a collaborative partnership between organizations who share similar missions to protect regional biodiversity, native plant habitats, and wildlife. These partners include the Audubon Center and Debs Park, California Botanical Garden, Grown in LA, Northeast Trees, National Park Service, Palo Verde Peninsula Land Conservancy, Theodore Payne Foundation for Wildflowers and Native Plants. Welcome, Cris.
All right, so yeah, I'll be talking about Seed LA. So Seed LA, we're a collaborative, as Renee mentioned. Here's some of our collaborative members, as well as some youth from the Northeast LA area, specifically Northeast Trees youth volunteers and staff there. And Renee read our mission there, and here's our collaborative. Once again, we have added LA Conservation Corps and Tree People. I don't know if that was on that original grouping, but we keep expanding. We keep building up our collaborative because it is a collaborative mission. We're looking at the greater LA area, so I think all these groups on that logo sheet, we all have a stake in this game, and so that's why we all came together, right? To create this mission, and really the main thing is that we're looking at locally adapted native seed. That's like, I think we were all friends in that. If you look at that logo, we're all friends. But that idea kept coming up that we need to make sure that we have locally adapted native seed. Preaching to the choir here, but you all know, we have our ecoregions, right? And they're so important to take into consideration when we're doing restoration work. And not just grabbing seed from any which where and just buying stuff, online and just bringing in seed from who knows where. We've started to see issues, and basically the issue is, these plant materials, there's an ecosystem. These plants are adapted to very specific sites. And so these plants are more likely to establish, survive, and promote those ecological relationships in the sites that they're from, right? So, at the bottom, you see Eriogonum fasciculatum. It's just a quick case study. You see all the different places it grows. You see all the blue dots where Eriogonum fasciculatum grows, right? And they're all completely different. And so I'm sure you've probably all seen restoration sites where you have a weird looking Eriogonum and you're like, what the heck? Like, why is it growing that way? Well, it probably came from that easier to harvest area on the third picture, right? And so there's probably some long-term issues that we're going to see in the future with species that depend on those very site-specific Eriogonums that we're kind of screwing up. We're playing God, and we're putting stuff in the wrong place. So we realized that this is an important thing. So that's kind of the mission of Seed LA. All our partners, we're already all kind of doing similar stuff. So Theodore Payne has the local source initiative. I don't know if you saw the booth downstairs, but they're making sure to have the local sourced plants labeled and making sure home gardens are planting the very site-specific species, right? The group I work with, Palos, Verdes, Peninsula Land Conservancy, we've been collecting local seed for our restoration projects, for our nursery. Just because we know there's something there, we may not fully understand the relationships, but we know that there's something very specific to the species of plants and the species of butterflies, pollinators. All the other groups as well, we're all kind of doing the same thing. We all came together, and we didn't invent this. Ellen Mackey had a group before us that had started to talk about this stuff. We just came together and we said, we just got to do this. We just got to implement it. Really specifically because of the LA River Master Plan. It's a huge project. It's a huge planning thing that went on for years. And all those dots you see going along the 50-mile LA River are projects. That's a lot of projects. That's a lot of projects that involve these beautiful parks and landscapes and aesthetically pleasing stuff. And it's all native plants. Like, majority is native plants. Well, who's going to provide those plants? I mean, these contractors are probably going to come in at the last minute, say, hey, I need this, this, and that. Nobody's going to have that. So and we know this, right? We deal with this every day. So we said, well, we need to prepare for these projects. And not just those, right? But that's a good example of this huge initiative going on. 30 by 30 money is coming down the line, right? So, all this stuff is going to get planned out. Contractors are going to, be the lowest bidder. They're not planning ahead. And they're going to come to all of us and say, hey, we need these plants. We're going to scramble, order from who knows who, grow some plants that aren't appropriate. We're going to destroy our ecosystems locally. So that was kind of, why we came together. We created a vision, what I just talked about. And really, it's not just about the seed, but it's providing resources to everyone else who needs those resources to make these projects successful. So I'll talk a little bit about one of the projects we're piloting right now, that we're offering our services as a collective, resources, information, helping with plant palette design, all that stuff, just so it's a successful project and we can continue to do more of these types of projects as a group. So this is what we do. Here's a picture of some of our members collecting seed along the Alley River. There's Alley in the background. And so we are collecting, we're processing, and storing. And we're doing it in a decentralized approach at this moment, just because we all have nurseries. We're all geographically spread out. LA's big. And so we're all just kind of storing seeds, prepping seeds. We all have our own missions, our own projects. We have our own volunteer groups. So we're all kind of doing it decentralized, keeping a nice database. Maybe in the future we'll have a centralized seed bank. But really at this moment, once again, it's a collaborative. It's not like we're getting paid to do this. We're actually all doing this out of our love for native plants, right? So we're using whatever we got. And so this is actually California Botanic Garden here, and they're storing a lot of the seed as well as theater pain. And yeah, we're starting to make seeds available for use in public projects. So we have allowed withdrawals of the seed bank at this point. Here's one of the challenges. Anybody here from LA? You know that, all that pink is developed, high intensity developments, and then the dark areas are less developed. They're still developed. So it's like, well, where the hell are we going to collect seed from, right? If that's the area we're trying to restore. So it's a huge challenge. And so we treat all the plants on our plant palette, a lot of coastal sage scrub, riparian, we treat them all as rare species just because we don't have this mass abundance of seed to collect. And so we only collect 10% or less off these species to make sure that our wildlife relatives have seed, right? And also for future generations to collect from it. So we're not trying to denude the landscape, but we do have to be careful. And so that limits really the amount of seed that we end up putting in the bank because we don't have a lot of places to collect from. Once again, preaching to the choir, you know that we're in a critical point, critical need, crazy mustard, pushing out our native plants. So we need to restore these sites. We're in a huge drought, so we're thinking, okay, maybe, theater pains type of project, maybe that expands, so we have more local seed for more nurseries to provide to homeowners, and not just the projects that we're thinking, these bigger scale landscape projects, but maybe our front yards provide some good habitat for our local species with local seed. And then the fires, right? In an instant, our seed banks out in the wild disappear. So we're kind of at a breaking point where we need to like pick it up and really do something quick. So we're taking all these things into consideration. And so some of the things we've been working on is just doing train the trainer workshops and making sure that we're basically creating an army of volunteers, of staff, of people that know how to do this and do it in the appropriate way of, seed collections, right? And making sure they know everything so that they're the future leaders of these collections, of these teams, of these future, new nonprofits that pop up, or National Park Service director, when Antonio leaves, finally, someone else will come in, right? And they're gonna have all that knowledge ready to go. And so train the trainer workshops is what we've been working on. We we got a nice grant from National Park Service and developed our mission, our vision, all this stuff, so that this group doesn't just fall apart when we all move onto other things, right? And so we have all that background. We got a grant to hire someone back in 2019, and so this allowed us to really get a lot done. We're all volunteers, I mentioned, so it's kind of like herding cats where we're all kind of busy doing things. So we were able to have someone get us all together and get things done. And so Gina Valono helped us for a few years. We'll be hiring someone new coming up. Another thing we worked on was we worked with UCLA to make a map of all the existing native plant populations in LA that were not planted or part of a restoration project. These are wild locations, at least as far as we could figure out, so that we know where to collect our seed from as a group and make sure that genetics are taken into consideration and it's not just some random seed from who knows where. So this is also something we looked at for future assisted migration to kind of take that into consideration if we have to go there when we give consultations to different groups as to what plant palette to take into consideration for their projects. We had a grant to do Juglins, California collections from sites that were original sites in Los Angeles. And so we collected at 5 locations. The idea behind this is to have conservation groves in different areas so that we have good genetics of juglins, because we have a lot of hybridization. We have a lot of northern juglins that was introduced back in the day. A lot of grafting went on. So we have all these weird genetics, but we have a couple sites where we know there's some good juglins. And if anybody here is from LA, you know there's a lot of gentrification going on, and a lot of those sites happen to have juglins on there. So hopefully this ties into making sure that we have good seed and protecting those juglins by just making sure we're all working together. So making sure that we just have those mother plants readily available so that we can kind of protect these sites. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'd say look further into it, because it's definitely a huge issue we're having in Northeast LA and North LA. We have a mobile seed bank unit, which is kind of a cool thing that was built for us from terraformation and One Tree Planted. And basically it's a self-sustained seed lab that it's on solar. It has a fridge in there. It has all the processing equipment. And it basically allows us to mobilize, go out, collect seed, process in the trailer, and implement on the same day if we wanted to, right? And it's a crazy little thing that was built for us. We're testing it out. We're actually using it for educational purposes to teach people, teach the youth about what seed banking is, how to collect seed, all that stuff, right? So it's a cool little thing. You'll probably see them try to market. Is anybody here from Terraformation or no? Okay, they're probably going to try to market it and try to sell it, right? Because it's a great idea. Not so much for us urban, but more for like forest areas that you don't have a place to go and clean seed and come back, right? So pretty cool thing that we're sharing between all the groups. And the last thing we're really proud of is this bow tie project. So bow tie's up in North LA near Elysian Park. And so we're working with California State Parks, Nature Conservancy. We're all partners, and we are basically going to help restore this crazy industrial lot with appropriately local native seed. So we've been assisting with the plant palette. We're going to do workshops for the community. We actually got community input to see if that's what they actually wanted out there. We're going to be working with the first LA Indigenous school, Anahuacal Mecak, and making sure that those students are involved. So once again, we have the next generation of stewards to take over these projects. And so really just trying to make sure we're taking the needs of the community into consideration, but making a pilot project so that we can replicate this on that first map I showed you of all those projects that are going to be happening along the LA River. Make sure they're good projects, successful projects, And so we just got $25K to hire a new coordinator. So if anybody's looking for a job, let me know, because we need someone, once again, to herd those cats. We're kind of all over the place, but we have the resources as a team to work together. So we're still looking for funding to match that. But lastly, I just want to share. I mean, we've kind of started the bank. We have about 500,000 seeds in our bank. We've started to allow withdrawals from different groups that need that seed, and we're starting to continue to do more seed trainings for our local community to take advantage, to learn, and to deposit into that seed bank, right? So that the seed's accessible for all of us to use as a team, because that's the only way we're going to succeed on this project, is to work together. LA's huge. We're as individuals, we can't get as much done as a group, right? So I share this not because I'm trying to promote our project, but really to hope that some of you will go back to your communities and create these seed banks, because this is what we need. We didn't invent it. We actually stole this idea from the East Coast, where they have Marsby. There's a group out there that was doing something very similar in New York and the East Coast. And so I think these are needed. These regional seed banks are going to be needed as we get more funding from 30 by 30, as we get more projects coming down the line, for them to be actually impactful and not just greenwashing. We need to make sure they're done well, right, and we all kind of work together. So I share that, and also if anybody has money out there and wants to give it to us so we can hire it, that's why I share it too. So thank you. And, Any questions? And also for any of the panelists, if you have questions. Yeah.
Have you approached any contract growers to make nursery stock available?
The question was if we've approached any contract growers to make more nursery stock available. And we've had those conversations. We're not trying to replicate or put any seed growers out of business. So that's not really what we're trying to do. We've actually grown some of that stuff in our nurseries to provide it back to projects at like no cost kind of thing. But so I don't know if we will do that, because we're not trying to compete. We're just trying to make a better quality plant stock. Yeah.
Are you planning on doing any seed bulking to have more seed available?
And the question was, are we planning to do seed bulking to make more seed? And yes, we've actually started to use some of that seed to make more seed bulking. The thing is, a lot of our collections are actually more of the dominant of plants that are out in coastal sage scrub or riparian. We're not really going for anything rare. We're with the assumption that these projects are looking for your more common species, right? And not really necessarily trying to get rare plants. So we have a lot of those species available. So if we had to, though, we will bulk up, and I think we all have resources to do that. Yeah.
How are you mitigating against plant pathogens like Phytophthora if you're at that stage of dispersing your seeds to people in LA?
And so for Phytophthora, we're just using BMPs, Phytophthora BMPs, and I believe there's a table downstairs if you want to know more about that. There's also a poster. But seed collection techniques, we are very careful to not collect stuff that's on the ground. Storage, disinfection of seed. We actually do long-term storage for a lot of this seed, and so we are taking that into consideration, with just Phytophthora in general, just because of our native plants. A lot of these groups that are in that collaborative, we're all involved in the Phytophthora network as well, and trying to make sure that we can minimize any spread, right? So, but yeah, great question. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, great job. Super exciting. And with the jugglings, you said you were going to establish some conservation population, right, around. Were any of those going to be going to the LA River project you were talking about?
I don't believe that was the mother plant location, but we do have some of those going there, right? And I don't know, that's a great question. And maybe I'll bring that up at our next meeting, because why not, right? Especially if that park it's going to be open space, forever. So that might be a good location. And if anybody in LA has locations that you would host mother stock, let us know. I mean, we're looking for more, and we have more collections lined up that aren't funded, but just will be part of our collection program. Yeah. And my time's up. Thanks, everyone. And we're all the speakers were sticking around if you have any further questions. Thanks.